Hey guys, what's going on today? In this video, we're going to be talking about Brewmaster talents. I get these questions a lot through both commentaries as well as through my Discord and Twitch chat. So in this video, I want to try to tackle some of the talent questions and inquiries that I've had over the last couple weeks. Now, I do still kind of planning on putting together an 11.0.5 guide. That is taking a little bit more time than I'd like. So I hope that this video can at least tie you over. Now, the assumption in this video is that you are primarily a MYTHIC Plus player and you already have a pretty decent understanding about how the talents. I don't want to dive into like every single choice that we take throughout our tree and like why we path a certain way, because there is a pretty set path for the monk trees. Now, don't get me wrong, the monk trees are pretty good. There's very little dead talents that will never take almost in any situation, unlike Paladin, for example, that has a stun reduction talent that just doesn't make sense inside of PvP. So luckily enough, the monk tree, both class and spec, is pretty universally like appreciated, and I think the tree's good. There are minimal changes I would make, especially the class tree. The spec tree, I would argue that there's some kind of weird choices, but without ranting too much, I want to basically break down when you're going to choose certain talents over others, more of the flexible points that you have, and depending on if you're playing Shado-Pan versus Master of Harmony and MYTHIC Plus, what talents you may opt to take, as well as when it'll change based on key level. So I'm going to try to have timestamps down below, and I'll try to keep this video as organized as possible. But without further ado, let's kind of dive into it. I'm going to make just a new profile, and I'm going to basically reset all of these talents and just kind of quickly walk through what the tree looks like. I'm assuming you know what most of these talents are, if not all of them, and we're going to really talk about where you're putting your choice nodes or your flexible points is what we'll call it. So we're going to start off by like fast feet, for example, Tiger's Lust, Grace of the Crane, Ancient Arts, as well as things like Calming Presence and Kick. These are pretty much almost in every single build. If you're not playing these, you're just playing suboptimally. That's all. That's pretty much it. Again, it is a video game, play what you want, but if you aren't playing these talents, you're probably losing out on a lot of value in just certain places. You do have 1 point here that you can either put into instant healing for yourself off of Vivify. You can do it for a Enrage Dispel, or you can do it for like a regular Dispel. You'll have more points to put into these. You can pretty much actually grab all 3, and the rest of these talents are pretty dead. Soothing Mist, as well as its Elusive Mist talent or counterpart, these are dead. As the Brewmaster specifically, Disable and Crash Momentum are essentially useless. While you can take Wind's Reach to increase the slow duration, the playstyle becomes really weird. And you're already getting a ton of slows through things like Special Delivery and Keg Smash by itself, so there's just no need for these talents as well. The slight 10% increased on the distance of Roll and Chi Torpedo are so minimal, it's not worth taking. And yes, you could take Jade Walk, but generally we already have 3 charges of Roll as well as Tiger's Lust. There's no reason for the additional mobility, and it's only at a combat, so it's not affecting you in combat, where these other things will be a little bit more potent. So the only thing I would say here is probably go into Detox, or you can go into Vivacious. You're going to be grabbing these anyways in this next section, because there's actually like too many points here. We have 12 points to spend before we get into the next section, and not all nodes, I guess, are necessarily acceptable to play with. We do need Transcendence only because Transcendence paths us in. Now, Transcendence isn't used in all forms of content, not really. There's some cheeky things you can do in dungeons like Line of Sight pulling. You'll see me do this in things like Siege and Stone Vault. But outside of that, we're really taking this to path through it. So we're going to grab things like Ferocity of Zuen, things like Ring of Peace, and then of course some of our defensive nodes like Fortifying Brew. Yulon's Grace can be used if you find yourself not hitting Diffuse at all in a key, just take Yulon's Grace. It's going to be equal, if not more, healing. Diffuse Magic, the reason you take it is a very powerful mitigation tactic in cooldown that you can actually utilize for certain tank busters that are more magic based. This is throughout most dungeons, but again, if you're not using this because you're just not taking enough damage for it to matter, don't play Diffuse, just play Yulon's Grace. Anyways, we're going to assume you're min-maxing and you are playing Diffuse and you're able to hit it and you know when to hit it. There aren't a lot of great times to utilize this for damage. There aren't any crazy dots that you can reflect back onto your targets with Diffuse Magic that you wouldn't just use as a tank buster. So in this season specifically, it seemed more as a mitigation tool than it is as a mitigation plus damage tool. Anyways, outside of that, we have already explored the center of the tree. Peace and Prosperity, while it seems good because it's reducing Ring of Peace, you oftentimes don't need Ring of Peace often enough where the 5-second cooldown is going to be useful. 45 down to a 40 isn't impactful enough to warrant taking Peace and Prosperity. I know I see a lot of people running it. You don't need to. You can if you want, but again, there's better points elsewhere. Chi Burst is non-negotiable. Again, if you like the more passive playstyle of Chi Wave, great, but arguably Chi Burst is going to get you way more damage, way more healing, and it just generally fits into the rotation and playstyle a little bit better than Chi Wave is currently. Chi Wave just needs a buff to warrant this to be a good choice node. The problem is Chi Burst significantly outperforms Chi Wave. So that's really the main issue here. So Chi Burst is the play. We're also going to grab Vigorous Expulsion, and then things like our movement node, we're going to take Celerity or Chi Torpedo. I prefer Celerity. Some people play Chi Torpedo. You don't necessarily need this, especially if you're going to play lighter than air. It just works better with Celerity. Tiger Tail Sweep is going to give you that increased range, which is going to be great, especially when you're pairing it with Ancient Arts. And then lastly, we have our Dampen Harm node. Unfortunately, this season, Dance of the Wind just isn't all that strong. I find that Dampen Harm is more useful for a Brewmaster who knows what buttons to hit and when. So now you can see that we have 2 points left. Like I said, there are some dead nodes up here. These are dead nodes, and these are kind of dead nodes for Mythic Plus. So the thing that you can spend these points on is either Hasty Provocation, you spend on Detox, you spend on Pressure Points. I don't recommend Improved Touch of Death. You're just going to get more value out of regular Touch of Death if you're keeping track of it. Energy Transfer can be okay if you're really on top of kicks, but I don't find it to be all that useful in the cooldown reduction of paralysis, because generally when you are using paralysis, you're using it after your kick, so you're not benefiting as much, though you can get a pretty good CDR on paralysis. You can get it down to a 20-second cooldown if you're really on top of your kicks. You can put it here. Again, most players aren't playing at that level. So what I'm going to say is default to Detox, though you're not going to need it in every dungeon, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. And then I would say Hasty Provo. The other points don't really matter too much here. And then that'll give us access to our third section, which we have 11 points to spend. We really only need 9 of those points to be spent in actual talents that are more or less non-negotiable. And then the last 2 points can be, again, flex nodes or flex points. So you're definitely going to want to play Strength and Spirit. The critical healing of Expel Harm itself is so lackluster that you just will never take Rebuttal. This shouldn't even be a choice node in my opinion. You just take Strength and Spirit every time. That'll allow you to go into Chi Proficiency, increasing your magic damage done and your healing done by a total of 4% when you're putting 2 points here. And then we're going to take Flow of Chi. So you're going to make this little C shape. And then on this side, you're going to typically take Expeditious Fortification. There are arguments that Iron Shell Brew can be good in specific dungeons, but more often than not, you're just going to take Expeditious and you're not going to even think about it. Bounce Back is really strong into Fatal Touch. And then our last 2 points we're going to put into Martial Instincts. This leaves us with 2 points left. I shouldn't say most, but a majority of players do like playing with Lighter of Air. This is good not only for additional mobility, but it also allows you to have cool negation of knockbacks. So this is seen, like a really good example of this is Dawnbreaker on the second boss, or I guess the mini boss that does the terrifying slam mechanic. You can get knocked back and then you can counter this knockback. You can negate falling damage with this. You can just generally use it for good mobility for whether it's kiting or whether it's traveling through a dungeon. Just a really powerful talent. I normally would recommend this, but again, it's not needed. You can definitely put it into another node. These 2 points right here, Swift Art and Save Them All, aren't really all that great for this dungeon or any of this dungeon set entirely. And then Celestial Determination is also pretty bad. It's like, while you have Nizao active, you can't be slowed, but you're not playing Nizao at all. So this is a dead node for us. There are a few niche nodes like Healing Winds and your Transcendence nodes, but I generally wouldn't recommend putting them in here either. These nodes are pretty cool. The Escape from Reality allows you to re-transcend within 10 seconds, and that allows you to use Healing Winds to gain roughly about 10% of your health back, 10% of your max health back per use. But it's not an efficient global. It used to be 15%, but they nerfed it. So it's just kind of not super great anymore. I would say the only nodes that are worth spending on is Windwalking, Lighter Than Air, and preferably Clash. Now, if you'd like to, you can also spend one of those points on Pressure Points if you want to Soothe, but generally I would go like Lighter Than Air or Clash, for example. Now, one nuance thing that I have talked about in previous videos and I preferably really like, but you don't see every Brewmaster running it, is Summon Black Ox Statue. There's some cool uses with this, from basically being AoE taunt, eating some auto attacks, as well as distracting certain mobs in, like, for example, Necrotic Wake third boss. You can use Black Ox Statue for some really cool things. You can use it as a group speed taunt with Hasty Provocation. I really like Summon Black Ox Statue. I just don't think it's seeing enough play at the top end. But again, these players are really min-maxing their kit, and they just don't feel like they actually need a Black Ox Statue to perform well. So it's a choice. but you're probably going to get more value out of things like Clash, or you're going to get more value out of things like Windwalking in a dungeon, especially ones that you can't mount in. So things like Stone Vault. So this is what the base tree looks like. Again, there's a few trades, but anyways, let's move over to the class or the spec tree really quick and talk about it. Your first 8 points are going to be pretty much locked into this build specifically. Special Delivery gains a lot more value out of both our tier set, as well as Rushing Jade Wind was significantly nerfed. Because of our tier set, we're getting more keg smashes for free with our 4 set. More keg smashes means more cooldown recovery. More cooldown recovery means more purification and Celestial Brew usage, which means more damage into Special Delivery. Basically, that's why it's better. It's also just baseline, it's better than Rushing Jade Wind. And then when you throw in this extra CDR we're getting from our tier set, it's just better, period. Rushing Jade Wind also takes away from our ability to spend energy very frequently, so that takes away from people who are playing Shado-Pan, which is arguably the better choice right now, but we'll get into this in a second. Anyways, in terms of this, you're going to see a pretty standard build on the left side of the tree. If you're playing Shado-Pan, you're going to go Scalding Brew. If you're playing Master of Harmony, you're going to play Salsa Bim, but for now, let's assume that you're just playing Shado-Pan. Now, in terms of Bob and Weave versus Black Ox Brew, this is a question I get asked all the time. They are arguably equal defensive value, but Black Ox Brew is going to be better. Actually, technically Bob and Weave is better defensively, but Black Ox Brew gives you the extra Purifying Brew and the Celestial Brew when you need it, which is way more important than just having like a flat base mitigation increase from things like Bob and Weave. And what's also kind of cool about Black Ox Brew in this season is it is a damage increase because we're trying to dump our energy as fast as possible. And for those who don't know, Black Ox Brew doesn't only reset your brews, but it instantly gives you 100% energy back. So you can really be aggressive with like keg smash, and like spamming keg smash, spamming Tiger Palm and or spinning crane kick, going all the way to 0 energy, and then resetting this offensively, getting your full energy back. Also, using Black Ox Brew does spawn a Special Delivery keg. So all in all, Black Ox Brew tends to be better if you're min-maxing. Again, Bob and Weave is fine. If you find yourself not hitting this or not doing hard content, just run Bob and Weave. It's not a big deal. It's going to be better defensively, but overall, Black Ox Brew tends to pull ahead. Now, on the right-hand side, most players will path through Zen Med for additional points defensively, but there are some times where you want to actually play One with the Wind versus Strike at Dawn versus Zen Med, and those reasons I'll get into in a little bit when I'm talking like high keys. But this is talking like, I would say like in the 10 range if you're trying to optimize your Brewmaster gameplay. It's much better to actually allocate your points like this to open up the later half of the tree, or the tier 3 of the talent tree. Wow, I keep saying tree over and over again. Your last set of talent rows, then putting it into Zen Med. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyways, you go into Tranquil Spirit. Obviously, you play Training into Pretense. You're also going to play Shadowboxing Treads and Counter-Strike. This will unlock the last tree. Now, if we kind of go work our way back and we only play Zen Med, now we have to put a point somewhere else. Generally, you're seeing this in the Quick Sip. Quick Sip is still very powerful. It's just you don't need to spend the point in the top half of the tree to get down. Plus, now we have Tranquil Spirit. But let's just go back to kind of our standard build. This will have you going into Elusive Footwork, Black Ox or Blackout combo, Weapons of Order, Chi Surge, Facepalm, and Anvil and Stave. And then on the other side, we're going to be going into Charred Passions. You're going to be going into Exploding Keg, Storm Stout's Last Keg, and then arguably one stack of High Tolerance. So this is what you're going to treat. Your tree is going to look like in the most general sense. Now, there's ways to optimize this, whether you're playing Shado-Pan versus Master of Harmony versus High Keys. So if you're starting to find yourself struggling to stay alive and you're playing Shado-Pan, you're going to want to drop things like Chi Surge and Facepalm to pick up your Ox talents. And this is what your tree will end up looking like. So this is the optimal Shado-Pan tree for defensive power. Now, here's the problem in Mythic Plus. Unless you're doing something like upwards of 14s or 15s in your current state, which is a handful of Brewmaster players, you're not going to benefit from just 1 point in Ox stance. You have to have Heightened Guard because attacks aren't going to be large enough to actually do 60% of your health pool consistently enough for you to sit. You're going to end up sitting at max stacks of Ox stance, which is 10, for a long time until those couple of tank busters, those couple of larger hits do come through. So that's why you're playing into Heightened Guard. Now, once you're doing high keys, you could argue Black Ox Adept, or you could argue for maybe a Determination for more defensive value. But generally speaking, this is what it's going to end up looking like. Now, let's quickly transition to the Shado-Pan tree itself. There isn't much to talk about here. This is pretty much set in stone. You're going to play Pride of Pandaria. High Impact isn't good enough in high content. You're not oftentimes going to actually be hitting mobs all that often. So most players are going to find out that they're going to end up, like most players end up running Pride of Pandaria, just generally it's going to be easier to use. There are times where high impact can do a ton of damage, especially with how frequently you can actually proc flurry strikes now, from it being reduced to every like 23 seconds to every like 16 to 18 seconds. You can definitely do this a little bit more often, but you're going to see the majority of players still playing Pride of Pandaria. This might change in future patches, I don't really know. Generally, Protect and Serve is also better. Not many people play Lead by the Front, but if you don't find yourself using your Instant Vivifies all that often, you probably are going to get more value out of Lead the Front, and then Predictive Training is pretty much a lock, and the rest of the talents aren't choice nodes. Now, if we shift over to Master of Harmony, this is where things are going to get a little bit different. When you're playing things like Master of Harmony, you're actually going to be dropping your Scalding Brew for Salsabims, and the reason for that is because you're not going to be casting Spinning Crank Kick as much, so you're not going to have as much uptime on Breath of Fire, and Scalding Brew really benefits by double dipping into some of those additional Shado-Pan traits that are amplifying both your Keg Smash as well as your Energy Spenders, which includes Keg Smash. So Salsa Beam Strength tends to be a little bit better, and with Salsa Beam Strength being added, you're actually going to swap over to Dragonfire Brew. Now, what's interesting about this tree in particular is the thing Overwhelming Force, which actually makes your single target abilities, including Rising Sun Kick, Tiger Palm, and Blackout Kick, which I know it cleaves based off of Shadowboxing Treads, but in this case, our single target abilities that I'm air quoting are going to basically shoot out a frontal line, like a little cone in front of us that will do a ton of damage. So that puts a lot of value into things like Facepalm. You also aren't as reliant on haste in this build, so you could arguably drop a thing like High Tolerance for Facepalm and play something like this as a defensive build. You can also tend to drop some other talents in this tree to get more damage, but really the meat of this, while Facepalm is really good for doing some big burst damage, it is somewhat RNG dependent, where Counter-Strike will probably provide you with enough damage anyways with Tiger Palm being casted, where Overwhelming Force will do anywhere from 5 to 8% of your overall, and I've actually seen keys where it ends up doing higher, depending on the key and the instance and the pull size. Our choice nodes in this tree, though, generally you're going to be playing Purified Spirit, which is going to make your any leftover Vitality erupt, dealing damage to everything nearby. This choice node is more for just mobility. You can either get a group Tiger's Lust. I think it just gives movement speed. Tiger's Lust grants 20% movement speed to 2 allies, so I think you end up playing Tiger's Vigor. But regardless, I can't even speak to it that much. I haven't tested it personally. And then this last one, you're generally going to be seeing Mantra of Purity, which is making Purifying Brew even more powerful than it already is. So with that being said, High Tolerance is generally a better play defensively because you want to get as much dagger as possible. And because of that, you're also going to normally see a lot more players leaning for a build that looks like this with things like Quicksip and Zen Med, because the idea is that you want to really put a lot of emphasis on your stagger so you can purify a ton of it. Therefore, you're going to be healing for a ton of it because of things like Guy Lin's Imperial Brew. Because you're going to be purifying more stagger per use, you're going to be also healing for more from this talent. So that's pretty much the difference between Shado-Pan and Master of Harmony in terms of talents. The only things you're really seeing changing are these two things here, and both of the talents put a different emphasis on other offensive notes, things like Chi Surge, things like Tiger Palm. The last thing I want to talk about is what dungeons are you going to take maybe things like pressure points versus detox. That's really the only big difference when it comes down to it. I want to talk about this, and I'll quickly talk about like high keys and some different talent choices you might have there. So let's take a look at the dungeon pool. Now, detox is going to be useful in a lot of dungeons. We're going to see a use for it in things like Arakara for a lot of the trash pulls, as well as the last boss. It's super good here. City of Threads, there aren't any poison dots. I guess there's only one that comes the little mini boss guy right before you enter in to I guess the inside of the city, which is when right before you verse off against the coagulation boss. You're gonna see the big spider dude casting poison. So detox is pretty good in here. Dawnbreaker, if I'm not mistaken, there aren't going to be any poisons that you can dispel off the top of my head. So you don't necessarily need detox in this run, but you also don't really need pressure points either, because there aren't that many enrages in this key. So realistically, you just keep detox. Stone Vault is a key where you can drop detox for things like pressure point, but again, it's not really needed because there aren't anything you really need to. There actually, if I'm not mistaken, there aren't any enrages in here either. The only dungeon where you don't need detox and you would preferably want pressure points are going to be two dungeons that I can think off the top of my head, which is going to be Grim Batol. There are some mobs located at the, let's go to Grim Batol. These Overseer guys, they cast this thing called Reckless Tactics, which makes them do more damage, but also makes them take more damage. But if this is going to be overwhelming for you, especially because these guys have a tank buster, what I recommend doing is taking pressure points so you can remove Reckless Tactics from this man here, or if you alternatively, you can remove it from the Brute because Brutal Strike does do a ton of damage as well. So pressure points is pretty good in this dungeon. Another dungeon that pressure points is really good in is actually Necrotic Wake. In Necrotic Wake, you have this boss that goes into an Unholy Frenzy, which increases his attack speed, which can be pretty lethal if you have Necrotic Bolts going off on the tank. So this boss, you're able to paralysis and remove that, which is super, super useful. This actually humbles a lot of tanks and people don't really know about it. You definitely want to soothe for this boss if you can. If you're running with a hunter or a druid or an evoker, this generally is fine. But if you're not running with one of those classes, having pressure points is really good for this dungeon. Now, detox. Now, the rest of the dungeons, I would arguably say the only dungeon you don't need detox for is going to be Grim Batol. Oh, and you can maybe make an argument for Stonefall because there aren't any poisons. But if you're someone who's doing 11s and lower, there is the Zalhath effects that requires you to dispel, so having detox is good anyways. So if you find yourself in that position, you can either drop Hasty Provocation for pressure points to have that there. If you're someone unlike me who doesn't care for summon Blackhawk statue and you want pressure points, that's also a fine trade. Or if you're someone who doesn't really feel like they need lighter than air, that's also a fine trade for this. But you can definitely drop some of these different points to pick up pressure points for the dungeons you need it. You don't have to necessarily drop detox, but it is an option to drop to pick up pressure points if you really prefer having some of these later talents. Now, last but not least, in high keys, what most brewmasters are currently playing, you're seeing a lot of people play Zenmed. And if you're playing Zenmed, you go into things like Quicksip, or alternatively, you can go into Determination. You're seeing a use of both of these talents in high keys. The reason why you run One with the Wind and or Strike at Dawn are in dungeons that have high mob counts in terms of like high auto attack counts. So what that means, so dungeons that would have like a ton of melee hits are going to include dungeons like Siege of Borealis, like especially early on, if you're doing like big pulls like this, or if you're pulling a lot of mobs early on in the dungeon, this is a good dungeon for that kind of dodge, the additional dodge or additional non-consumption of your Elusive Brawler stacks. Other good dungeons for this are going to be things like Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake is very good, especially at the start of the dungeon when you're pulling a ton of soldiers, you're pulling a bunch of blight bags. It's also going to be very good for Stonefall when you start to do some of these like double and triple pulls. While these mobs do cast a ton, they also do a ton of melee, especially once you start kicking them and interrupting them. So this is a very good dungeon to actually utilize these talents. You also don't necessarily need Zenmed. So the argument and the reason why you might not play these two talents is like, okay, are there a lot of mobs hitting me? Probably not really. So I'm going to get more value out of Zenmed. Or the argument is there are some very specific tank busters that I'm going to need Zenmed for. So Dawnbreaker is a great example of this. The first boss in Dawnbreaker does a massive, massive hit called Obsidian Beam. And you definitely want to mitigate this. I see a ton of tanks die here. You have to use mitigation when this cast starts before it starts channeling. Because right when it starts channeling, it does a ton of tank damage to its primary target. So Zenmed is really good for that. It's really good for like the terrifying slam on the boss as well as the mini boss that you're doing. Zenmed is really good. Obviously, it's a little nuanced because you have to not get hit like by an auto attack, but generally speaking, it's a little bit better. Which also allows you to play into Quicksip, which ends up being more baseline mitigation across the entire key than kind of hoping that you're dodging. It is kind of funny that there are a lot of people who aren't even playing Capstones, so a lot of people aren't even playing Ox Dance because you generally just like don't necessarily even need it. You could just put a second point into High Tolerance, then you could put a point into Facepalm, so you're playing something like this, which goes to show how weak the Capstones are, because some people just straight up aren't playing the Capstones at all. It's just kind of interesting to look at. Not everyone's playing Anvil and Stave, and even if they are, they're only putting 1 point, because the total cooldown reduction you're going to end up getting from Anvil and Stave is kind of capped, so you don't really need to put more than 1 point here. But it's just kind of interesting to see that this ends up what the tree looks like. Anyways, I hope that kind of makes sense. I hope that helps with any talent questions people do have. I've been getting a ton of questions in chat about it. But if you're not going to run heightened guard, there's no point in running Ox Dance unless you're doing like the highest end of keys. Double point into high tolerance to get more effectiveness on stagger. Quick sip adds like a ton of benefit here. You could also play like Zen Med. So I hope that, again, I hope that helps. Thank you guys so much. Big shout out to all my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, I wouldn't be able to make content like this. And I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.